Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
The Trump administration pledged to shift the Federal Emergency Management Agency away from a bloated DC-centric deadweight, but FEMA's regions, not its Washington headquarters, bore the brunt of the workforce cuts that happened without any strategic planning. That's according to the latest Government Accountability Office report on FEMA's workforce challenges. Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday joins me now with more details. Justin, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
What were the big findings in this latest report on FEMA?
Well, GAO tallied FEMA's workforce losses over the last 18 months at roughly 4,500 employees, which is in line with kind of what we've been reporting and tallying over the last year and a half. Most of those staff left under the Trump administration's voluntary workforce reduction programs. But what GAO found here specifically for FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security is that they allowed these workforce cuts to happen without evaluating any sort of current or future workforce needs. And those reductions and lack of planning may impact mission readiness at FEMA. You know, FEMA has not had any big disasters to have to respond to, but it's been struggling with workforce shortages dating back to 2017, really, in that big hurricane season. And while it's been a little bit quiet, relatively speaking, lately, FEMA's workforce is kind of at a low over the last decade or so as far as number of employees. And so that's certainly raising some concerns when it comes to the fact that GAO found there wasn't really any thought to getting down to this level.
We all watched these workforce reductions play out really across the government. So what in GAO's report was particularly troubling about how they played out at FEMA?
Well, FEMA, of course, was swept up in these big workforce reductions across the federal government starting last spring. But they had a series of leaders, and they were really in turmoil for the last year plus. First, you had Cameron Hamilton, who has come back around to be the FEMA administrator. He was the acting administrator back in the spring, and he was fired for saying that FEMA should just continue to exist. He was replaced by David Richardson, a senior DHS official who was then performing the duties of the FEMA administrator. And David Richardson rescinded FEMA's strategic plan in May of last year. That was really the guiding light for how FEMA evaluates all of its needs, including workforce. I spoke with Chris Curry, who is GAO's Director of Homeland Security Issues, about kind of what effect that had on FEMA's workforce planning.
FEMA kind of threw out all of its workforce planning principles that it had been using for years. And these principles were designed to make sure it's ready to respond to what happens in the country if there's multiple events. It made these reductions basically without thinking about what they needed or who they needed. Recently, FEMA has actually started this hurricane season, was actually hiring again to fill critical needs. I'm not sure what good it does you to get rid of a lot of people without thinking about it, only to have to hire people back because you need them.
You mentioned, Justin, that these hit the FEMA regions particularly hard. What did GAO find there?
Yeah, this caught my eye because I think if you've been following FEMA closely, you kind of aren't surprised by that top line GAO finding while still being very important. But it did seem like FEMA just kind of shed staff very quickly and randomly over the last year. But what was new here with the GAO report was this breakout of how these reductions happened across FEMA's regions. It splits up the country into different regional directorates that really spearhead any sort of response to disasters in those regions. And most of the regions saw a loss percentage of 9% or more between January 20th, 2025 and January 10th, 2026. That was the deadline for folks to go through those voluntary workforce reduction programs. For instance, Region 10 up in the Pacific Northwest, where these wildfires are happening right now, they saw 10% of their workforce depart. Down in California in Region 9, and kind of the western region there, 13% of that region's workforce departed. And then you swing over to the Southeast, Florida and the Southeastern United States, where, of course, hurricanes from the Atlantic are primed to kind of hit. They lost 10% of their regional workforce there. FEMA headquarters, while being by far and away the biggest kind of component of FEMA compared to the regions, it just saw 5%, a 5% reduction in its staffing, which is significant, but certainly percentage-wise, not nearly as significant as what those regions saw. And this is interesting because the Trump administration pledged to kind of drain the swamp with FEMA specifically. It was a frequent line under former Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, and that's not what happened here.
And we heard Chris Curry say up at the top of the conversation here that FEMA is beginning to rehire. Where are they going next with rebuilding the workforce? Do they have a new strategic hiring plan in place?
Not yet, but that could be coming soon, because what FEMA told GAO as part of this report is that they will start working on a new strategic plan once a confirmed FEMA administrator is in place. And then that will lead to a new workforce analysis. And FEMA is on the cusp of getting that Senate confirmed administrator. Cameron Hamilton is expected to be included in this batch of nominees that the Senate votes through before leaving town for August recess. So they could have a FEMA administrator in place very, very soon. And they could start working more on some of these workforce challenges, as Chris Curry mentioned, with the hiring that's now started. But, these things take time. And I think, to Chris Curry's point, disasters don't wait. Here's what he said about that.
Last year was the first year in many years we did not have a large landfalling hurricane. So luckily, we didn't have to see what FEMA's response to that would have been with all these reductions. However, we're not going to get lucky like that every year. And I think that's my biggest concern.
Again, that's Chris Curry, GAO's Director of Homeland Security Issues.
Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday. Justin, thanks for getting us up to speed on this.
Sounds good. Thank you, Terry.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com.